we now have, I hope, a significant period of time to ask some questions. I'll go ahead and get the ball rolling by asking the first question, which is actually really directed at all three of you, and it goes to something that Dr. Lott was just talking about. So we see lots of polling data, well, some polling data on why people vote. I'm wondering if any of you have seen data on why people don't vote. In the state of Kansas, we are defending our proof of citizenship requirement. We're one of 4 states that have that. And one of the things we did in the process of discovery for the litigation is we conducted a poll and asked people who hadn't registered the reasons why they didn't register. And it was an open-ended question, and none of them gave the response, I didn't register because I didn't have a citizenship document, which is really one of the essential questions we were wondering about. I wonder, has there been any polling of that question, not for registration, but for voting? Why didn't you vote? And what are the reasons that people give for not voting? And then specifically, is there a significant percentage that say, I didn't vote because I thought the election was going to be conducted unfairly, any sort of fear of fraud or integrity-related reason given for not voting?
The U.S. Census has conducted post-election studies going back quite some time, and the major reason that they see that people don't vote in a similar sort of question is that they just didn't bother, they weren't interested, they forgot. It was basically issues of convenience and non-interest were the major reasons. I can't recall whether or not concerns about fraud were mentioned, and since it was an open-ended comment, I'm sure there were probably some people that said that, but it would be in the other bucket.
John, anything to add?
I can tell you that the Census Bureau's numbers for 2016 are actually going to be coming out in another month. So it's some information that I think would be useful for you and the commission to take a look at, because I think they're going to get into those kind of questions with the newest data from 2016.
Okay, thank you. Ken?
Excuse me. Let me first thank all three of you all for very thoughtful presentations. My first round of questions will deal with election administration. Therefore, Mr. Brice, I want to start with you. One of the big issues across the last several elections is the whole notion of voter suppression. And one of the, I think, misconceptions out there in play is that some central authority within a state, as opposed to local boards of elections or townships, make the decision about placement of voting machines. Mm-hmm. Secondly, there's this conception or misconception that these local authorities have shelves full of voting machines so that they should be able to anticipate changes in voting patterns or turnout from one election to another. And I will just set this up for you by saying that in Ohio in 2004, a very successful strategy that was implemented was to talk to youngster students at Ohio State University with a population of 58,000 to say, vote in Ohio as opposed to voting at home, which was legal. So that what happened was that there was a flood of voters in the precincts that really broke turnout records. Right. And as a consequence, there were long lines. The misconception is that those long lines reflected a deliberate voter suppression, as opposed to looking at the realities that it actually was a good strategy based on the fiscal constraints and availability of voting machines by local boards of elections. So how do we sort of right this record? Am I wrong? Are most voting machine decisions at the county board of elections level or local level? And how do they deal with those problems?
In most jurisdictions around the country, it is at the county level or at the township level, as you have here in New Hampshire. where they make the decisions in terms of the allocation of machines. Now, in many instances, they're governed by how many registered voters there can be in a precinct, and that determines, under state law, whether or not they need 2 machines or 4 machines or that sort of thing. So there's that variation. I was a member of the Long Lines Commission in my county in 2013, looking at what we had the problems in Prince William County. And what we found is that indeed there was a problem of too many registered voters in a precinct. Their precincts were too large. And as a result, it was governed by how many machines they had at that point in time. But as a result, we added 14 more precincts to the county so that each of the precincts could be smaller in size. That improved things immensely, so that by the time we got to 2014 and 2016, we didn't have those long lines. The other thing that we've been encouraging in my county, Prince William County, is to absentee vote. Absentee vote ahead of time. We are a suburbs of Washington, D.C. People spend a lot of time coming from our county to get into D.C. to their workplace. Under Virginia law, if you're going to be away from the county for 11 hours, you can vote absentee. And so we encourage people this time to vote absentee, and we've seen a bigger increase. The absentee rate varies across the country, varies by jurisdiction. Basically, you see in New England and the upper Northeast, absentee rates tend to be lower. Absentee rates are better when you go further west in this country. But that has a big impact on whether or not you've got the long lines.
And I wanted to make sure we understood what, so that was, the fix was for the next election.
That's correct.
There's very
That's correct.
little that you can do in the moment.
It is. In the moment, it's very, very difficult. I mean, basically, we were allocating machines in June for the November election. Now, one of the problems that we had in 2012 is that in June, we had X number of registered voters, whichever it was, but we had a big increase in September. And that wasn't taken into account in terms of the allocation of machines because they had done it in June.
Right.
And so that was another problem that we had. Again, we solved that by changing the number of registered voters and increasing the number of precincts in the county.
And let me just say for my colleagues, the reason I'm asking this question is because control of the narrative is so important, and the narrative has to be steeped in facts. So if in fact, if the question is the purpose of this commission to advocate things that would actually suppress votes, it would seem to me that we need to start off with the fact that things occur in elections that are impacted by the financial constraints of election administration, the fact that these are locally controlled operations that in large measure are impacted by the financial status of the local authority, and secondly, impacted by the strategies conducted by the campaigns, so that long lines can in fact reflect political success in the execution of a campaign strategy versus the intentional creation of long lines to discourage voters from sticking around and voting.
Right. I think the financial consideration that you've outlined is very much key in this country.
Absolutely.
We don't provide enough money for the conduct of elections. And we don't know how much money is spent in the administration of election. It is a project that I would love to get into.
Thank you.
Secretary Dunlap?
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Again, as
Former Secretary of State Ken Blackwell said, I want to echo his thanks for you coming here and making these presentations today. Found them all fascinating. Mr. Brace, you said something that caught my ear, which is that home ownership is the #1 driver to turnout. Would it also follow that those would constitute the easiest demographic to identify?
Certainly. Certainly, it does. I mean, the census data gives you demographics down at the very small level of what percent are homeowners versus what percent are renters. And indeed, you can see that variation if one, and I always encourage election officials, administrators, to take a look at their own county and take that data down at the precinct level to see how that varies in your own jurisdiction. We see in Prince William County immense changes in terms of down at Woodbridge versus up in the northern part of the county. You can see that, but it is governed an awful lot by that home ownership question.
Thank you. And Dr. Smith, you made us, your presentation was wonderful. You did say something about in New Hampshire, those who are domiciled versus citizens. Can you clarify that?
I can. I think Secretary Gardner could probably do a better job than this than I can. But
I rely on academics.
That's a mistake.
the court rulings in New Hampshire say that the requirement for voting is that you're domiciled here, which has been interpreted to mean that you spend most of your nights in the state. So this is a question that comes up routinely in election years. I live in Durham, where the University of New Hampshire is, a big college town. We often get complaints that there are college students who are out-of-state students who are voting, but it is legal in New Hampshire for you to have a Massachusetts driver's license and have Massachusetts plates on your cars and pay out-of-state tuition to the university and still be eligible to vote because you are domiciled in New Hampshire, meaning you spend most of your nights here. So there is a distinction in the law between citizenship and domicility in New Hampshire.
And I find the point fascinating because we did a study in the state of Maine some years ago when we were looking at establishing a residency requirement to get a driver's license, and we found in the 38 titles of Maine law, there's got to be at least 25 categories of definitions for what constitutes a resident, and it does seem to cast a pretty broad net. And interestingly enough, probably the most serious qualifications for citizenship would be to get a resident hunting or fishing license, mostly to keep people from New Hampshire from shooting all of our deer, I would imagine.
We got plenty of our own.
So I think along that line, that's something for us, I think, to bear in mind is that among the several states, these are questions that have great variety, but the issue of where's your pillow seems to be a key question here in terms of your ability to vote versus being a homeowner is different. I mean, I know. I was having this conversation this morning before I settled in Old Town for one academic year as a graduate student, which was 28 years ago, which is reflective probably more of my inertia than it is my academic abilities as a graduate student. It's not been that long of a year. I didn't plan on staying there, but I did. And what we find is that in my life, I mean, I think I've lived in about 8 different places. I moved 6 times in 5 years. And I think that's fairly typical for young professionals and students and others who move around a lot. And that's something that it makes it harder to track if they don't own that home and stay put and they're reliable. So.
It is another interesting fact coming from the Census Bureau is that basically about 17% of the American public moves every year. That's phenomenal. Now, that has come down since the 2008 problem with the recession and that sort of thing. It dropped down to about 11%. But that's the amount of change that they see every year.
Could I just emphasize that specifically to New Hampshire? Between 2000 and 2008, about 1/3 of our potential voters were different people. And that was similar. It was 30% between 2008 and 2016, where about 1/3 of the potential voters were different people than they were prior. So looking for trends and trying to figure out what's going on is a very difficult thing when you do have that kind of mobility.
But it's the same people who are moving.
And I'll conclude with Mr. Vice Chairman. I think the thing that serves as something of a touchstone for all of us here is that regardless of whether or not people move 6 times in 5 years or they live in the same house their whole lives, we have to be very careful when we're talking about things like additional security layers or additional integrity measures, is that we are talking about citizens who have a fundamental right to vote, and we need to be mindful of that.
Secretary Gardner had a follow-up question to Secretary Dunlap's, and then we'll go to Commissioner McCormick after that.
Thank you. this is directed to you, Kim.
Okay.
This commission had requested public information. It asked for only what is actually legally public in each state in the country. With all the work you've done over the years, are you aware of any state that does not provide the public in that state the information like who voted in the election, whether someone did or not, a list of the names of those who were registered and able to vote, so that the request that the commission made was that even if a state only made public the name and address of a person, that if that state sent that information, that was in compliance with the request that this commission made. So are you aware that there are any states that do not allow the public to see the actual document of the election itself that shows who was eligible and who voted and who didn't?
It does vary across the states with different state laws in what is allowed to be available and not allowed to be available. But it's generally the case that one can get access to that kind of information. The kicker is that sometimes it's the candidates that have access to it, or the state parties that have access to it for a campaign purpose, but not necessarily some academics or other kinds of people. It varies, though, in terms of different states in how they put on those restrictions.
So there are some states that don't make it public. They don't let their citizens
They'll
actually see.
they'll make it public, right, but it's in what form is it
And to
in?
whom?
And to whom?
But I mean public, I mean for any person. Like in New Hampshire, we have the right to know law. Anything that is a government document, any person has the right to come in and ask for that and get it. And so voting being a public act, the process can be secret how they actually vote.
Sure, absolutely.
The process, I mean, how someone votes, but the process is a public process, and that process creates a public document. And that document is a governmental record. Are there states that don't allow that kind of governmental record to be available to anyone who wishes it?
I don't believe there is on that side.
Commissioner McCormick?
To the panelists, I have a few questions. As a commissioner on the EAC, I understand the problems with data collection, of course, with our EVE survey, and the differences in interpretation of the questions that we ask and the data that is submitted. For example, what is actually early voting? Does it include absentee voting? You know, the issues. Right. I know IEEE and some others are working on a common data format. What are your thoughts on a common data format for reporting election data? Is it feasible? Is what are the downsides to it? Is this something we should be pursuing?
I have been a member of the Common Data Format team under NIST and participate in their weekly conversations and conference calls that we talk about that common data format. So I've been intricately involved in that process. It is possible, if it's produced correctly, that you can have that kind of information. And part of the goal, I know the goal of the EAC, is to make that common data format something that everybody can then share, and it can also improve your data collection effort on the EVE survey to get the information. It's still going to take some time, though. There's still different interpretations. Each of you interpret different ways of saying what turnout is, or what is registration, as I showed there. So it varies across the board, but it's clear that we need to have a central locality where we can collect that information and get it into a common format so that everybody can make use of it.
Thank you. Do you know if the Census Bureau has worked on that issue at all?
I have, because I do so much work with the Census Bureau in addition to election administration, I've tried to bring them into the process also.
Dr. Lott, I am unfamiliar with the NICS database. Could you let me know who maintains that database and where do they get their information from?
Yes. Well, the NICS system is run by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms within the Department of Justice. And they have reporting requirements for, law enforcement from around the country. And there's also been some recent changes with regard to mental health and other things that wouldn't be relevant for this commission. But, it's basically requirements that law enforcement around the country are required to keep an updated database and to report that information constantly to NICS. As there's information required from the State Department and other places with regard to citizenship information, whether people are here on a visa, for example. It's interesting, but as I said, a lot of the same rules that determine whether you can vote determine whether or not people are legally able to own a gun.
It's interesting. Dr. Smith, regarding trust in paper ballots versus machine cast ballots, do you think part of the reason for the mistrust of machines is that a lack of understanding of the technology in that? I mean, it's very simple to understand a paper ballot. It's not so simple to understand the complexities of how the DRE machines work, and has that been studied at all?
I'm not aware specifically of that, getting down to that level, but it's certainly a plausible explanation. And I think with a paper ballot, to be able to point to something that you can physically hold in your hand, I think is more comforting to most people than knowing that it sits on a chip someplace.
Yeah, and of course, the accessibility community has issues with paper ballots, and I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. To be able to vote privately is an issue there as well. Do any of you know whether there have been studies on the lack of civics education? I mean, in the early 60s, as your graph pointed out, we had more turnout, and I think there's kind of a correlation in the drop in civics education across the country with turnout. I don't know if anybody's done any of that studying.
As a professor in political science, I hate to say that there probably has been a decline in the number of hours that are being taught. Primary and secondary schools are required to teach a lot more things now than they were, say, 30 or 40 years ago. But as I pointed out, I don't know if we can point to one single thing like civics education as being a cause of decline. It's certainly one factor that could be in play, but I would be hesitant to say that is the reason that we've seen a decline.
Thank you.
As a political scientist, I would like to see greater civic education.
You can make it up in your classes in college.
Okay.
We're going to go now to Secretary Lawson, and then we'll go to Commissioner Von Spakovsky.
Well, thank you, panelists, for being here today. I enjoyed your presentations. I have a couple of questions about what influences an infrequent voter. I've been reading some studies recently, and what I've been reading is that the ability to vote on Election Day anywhere, like the vote center concept, would influence an infrequent voter to get an urge on Election Day and show up versus the availability of increased early absentee ability. So have you seen any studies on that, and have you determined for yourself what that might be to influence that infrequent voter?
Well, certainly from the standpoint of election administrators, they're very much interested in what is potential with the vote center concept. It is a concept that has come into being in probably the last 20 years to try to see what can be done. In many ways, it is like an absentee location. We have in my county, we have 4 absentee locations that you can go to before the election day and cast an absentee vote. You can cast it on a machine, on a paper ballot, whatever the case may be. It's all available there. They're strategically placed within the county to help people get to a relatively central location from their standpoint. It's that kind of convenience to the voters that a lot of election administrators are experimenting with to try to improve that process to get more people to turn out.
Have you seen any studies about the infrequent voter, and, did they take more advantage of an opportunity to vote early, or do they take more advantage of the opportunity to vote any place in a county on election day?
I don't know that there's been specific studies on that unless you've
Yeah, I've
seen.
done work on that. Essentially just looking at the overall participation rate and to see how that changes as you change these different rules. And I can just kind of go through some of these things. Probably, the biggest things are like registration by mail changes. Same-day registration has a big impact. A little bit further down, you have things like vote by mail, provisional ballots, absentee ballot has about a 5 percentage point increase there. I could tell you the different amounts, but it's when you're trying to account for all these different factors at the same time, that's kind of the relative ranking that you see in terms of changes. Now, whether that's real legitimate people doing it or some increase in fraud that you might see for some of those things, that I can't tell you the distinction.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Bunce-Bukowski?
Dr. Smith, and Kim, if you want to answer on this too. The study that you showed, and a lot of folks in this area say there's been this general decline in turnout after the 1960 election. But as you probably know, there are a number of statisticians and other social scientists who say that those numbers are not correct. And the reason they say is that the 1960s numbers are based on voting age population. And since that time, of course, we've had a much larger increase of non-citizens in the country, which are included in the VAP numbers, even though they can't vote, and the prison population has gotten much larger. And in 48 states in the country, of course, you can't vote when you are in prison. And these other statisticians say that when you actually take that into account, and instead of using VAP, you use citizen eligible voting age population, that there actually has not been a steady decline, that it has kind of leveled off and stayed, I think, pretty much the same. And what do you say about those numbers and that analysis of the statistics used in this area?
Voting age population does have a series of weaknesses, as you point out. Voting eligible population, I think, is a better measure to use. As Mr. Brace would tell you, that's a more difficult challenge to get that information over time historically, and that's one of the reasons in historical analysis it's usually voting age population that's pointed to. I think that you're probably right that the turnout figures, once you adjust for those factors, are better than are reflected in the voting age population numbers. But I think that the decline still is there since the 1950s and 1960s. It just may not be as dramatic given the increase in the population of people that aren't eligible.
All right. And Kim, I can call you Kim. We've known each other for more than 2 decades. I had a question for you because you keep track of voting equipment.
Yes.
So you know the voting equipment that's used in every county and township in the country and in the states. And I have a question for you. I just saw on the news that Virginia has decertified DRE, or direct recording equipment. Now, my understanding of Virginia is that they overwhelmingly use OptiScan paper ballots for voting. But in order to comply with the Help America Vote Act passed by Congress in 2002, which required that at least one voting machine in each precinct be one that people who are disabled can use. For example, people who are blind can vote independently. The only equipment that allows you to do that is a DRE. So I guess my question is, it's 2 months before their election. I'm assuming that from what you know, the voting equipment in that state, they're not going to be in compliance with that requirement.
It is a possibility. There are, I believe it's 22 counties in the state of Virginia that are suddenly scrambling since the Friday decision of the state board. And certainly one of the considerations they've got to take into account is the handicap voting. There are some devices that could be available from that side to make that a little bit easier and to allow you to at least have that kind of a capability. I know in my precinct in Prince William County, we have, in essence, a DRE that produces a paper, that produces the optical scan ballot. And that is then read like all other optical scan ballots, so that you get that capability of the voter being able to see on a screen what is the variation. And the benefits of those kind of screens is that you can get them with different languages in different size type. You can assist the voter in a lot more ways by having that kind of electronic capability if it's coupled with the paper ballot. Unfortunately, if you look at vote history in this country, the American public knows how to foul up a paper ballot. That is one of the unfortunate facts that we have. So the question is how to help the American voter mark the ballot properly. That's the key. And education, I think, is critical to that.
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment addressing what Professor Smith just said, and that is, you mentioned two things that are happening. One, kind of foreign-born population increase, but also the prison population. Prison population can't explain the change. I mean, you've had an increase in prison population, but it's been much more than offset by the changing voting rules in terms of allowing people who are felons to be able to go and vote. From 2000 on, you've had major changes across the states. And that kind of stock of people who now can vote who were felons dramatically much more than offsets any change that you've had in the number of people who are in prison.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. Dr. Lott, I wasn't going to follow up on this, but Commissioner McCormick's questions kind of reignited my interest in your presentation about the instant check system. Now, my understanding, since it's been a few years since I've run one of these checks, but I used to do it, that somebody fills out their form. It used to be the form 4417. I think it's 4473 now. And they put all their proprietary information on there, and you make the call, and you specify long gun, handgun, and you give them the information, and they come back with one of three responses, which is either proceed, deny, or delay. And our ATF agent told me that delay, usually the most common demographic to get caught up in a delay are law enforcement officers, because they tend to buy and sell a lot of guns, and it raises a flag in the system. But in my experience, they never tell you why someone's delayed or denied. It's just denied.
But that information is there. It's easy to access. There's no reason why it can't be provided. There's no law that says that they can't provide it. They just have streamlined the system to basically give what's necessary for the store or the FFL who's handling it. There's no reason why the FFL has to know why the person's been denied being able to go and purchase the gun.
Well, I guess I was sort of under the impression you're making a comparative analysis, but are you suggesting that we use the NICS system for elections?
Sure, I don't see why not. You have the same, I mean, there may be alternatives, and we could talk about alternatives, but here you have something that many people who would be involved in this debate are on the record, whether they think this is a good system or not. It seems like it would solve a lot of the political divisions that are there. And it has in the database the types of things that you would want to look at in terms of whether or not somebody would be qualified for voting.
I would think ATF would have some concerns about that.
Well, I'm not sure why. I mean, they go, for example, as I mentioned, the state of Kentucky, every month they use the database to go and see all the concealed carry permit holders in the state, whether or not they've been flagged. A lot of states do it once a year. You know, that's completely their choice, whether they use it once every month or once a year, or they could do it once a day. The ATF just, provides the services when it's requested. Now, maybe if all the states went, there'd be increased demand for their services, and Congress would have to allocate some more money to them. But it's not like this is a technically sophisticated problem there. These states constantly compare their lists of concealed carry permit holders to the database that's there, and it's a relatively simple process. My understanding is for Kentucky to run this. You're talking about something that takes minutes for them to do.
Well, I would observe, Mr. Vice Chairman, that what, if implemented, we'd be witnessing a sterling example of the laws of unintended consequences in public policy.
In what way?
The NICS system wasn't designed for elections. It was designed for doing background checks on firearms sales.
No, but it's the same things that disqualify you from being able to own a gun that would disqualify somebody from voting.
Well, when I would make those background check calls, I was talking to a live person. It wasn't punching in data.
No, but you don't have to. I mean, obviously, that's one reason why these checks are so costly when you privately transfer a gun. You have somebody,
But ATF didn't charge us for that.
right? No, but when you're talking about an FFL doing it, the FFL has to take time. Sometimes there are delays. They have to charge an average cost in order to overcome it. One of the reasons why, places like New York City and Washington, D.C. have these incredibly high costs is just, you have other regulations that are imposed by localities that are there that don't have anything to do with how the NICS system actually functions. But you can just see, I haven't gotten access to the cost for individual states that compare their CCW, their permit holders to it, but my guess is it's a pretty trivial cost for them to go and do that, if they do it in that type of batch data set there.
Well, I mentioned the unintended consequences. I mean, we started issuing driver's licenses in the 1920s to show that someone was qualified to operate a motor vehicle, and now it's become this global identity document. It was never intended to do that. We started putting pictures on driver's licenses to keep kids from using their big brother's driver's license to buy beer.
Right.
That was the public policy purpose behind that. And now you see us scanning around all the complications of the Real ID Act. We've talked about voter ID and other issues. That was never what that document was intended for. Just like NICS was never intended to be used as an elections tool. So it's just something that I find a rather strident departure from how we use technology.
Mr. Vice Chair, can I follow up on that?
Oh, go ahead,
Yeah,
follow up, yeah.
Are you suggesting that we completely replace other databases, or is this just another data set that we can run lists against? I mean, we already use a lot of different databases, NCOA and driver's licenses and.
Sure. But this one has kind of one-stop shopping, in terms of covering all the different aspects and citizenship and whether somebody has a criminal record for the places that it matters, whether you have a criminal record. And one reason for using this is that it's been hashed out in the political debates lots and lots of times. People who might normally object to having these types of checks done have been on the record many times over about how they think the NICS system works. And so, if this is a system that they have honestly believed over time is a fair and accurate way of determining whether or not somebody's legally able to go and own a gun, presumably they would also think that it's not going to suppress voter turnout.
Let me ask a question on a slightly different topic. Although I would like Dr. Lott to respond first and then the others as well. You mentioned that you've made some effort to track what is a central issue in this whole debate about photo ID, and that is the any effect that that change may have on subsequent voter participation rates. There was a study that the GAO did a couple years ago, attempting to derive some conclusions. My impression, as being someone whose degree is not in statistics, is that it was a rather rudimentary calculation that the GAO did. They took a handful of states that made the change to photo ID, including Kansas and Tennessee, and then they took a handful of states that did not make the change to photo ID over the same time period, including, among other states, Maine, I think, was on the list. And then they said, here is the change in participation rates from the presidential election in 2008 to the presidential election in 2012 in the two states that adopted photo ID. Here's the change, the delta, in the states that did not adopt photo ID. Here's our conclusion.
Right.
And here are the differences. And when I read that, I was struck that it was a complete apples to oranges question. I looked at Matt's state, Maine, and saw that they had all kinds of amazingly interesting things on the ballot, including a public initiative in 2012, whereas in Kansas, 2012 was something that happens every 12 years in our cycle, where there's no presidential race, no U.S. Senate race,
Right,
and no
exactly.
statewide officer. So you had nobody running a statewide campaign, and so 12 was one of our very low political activity years. And the GAO didn't account for any of that.
Right, even
And
how close it was with regard to the presidential races, and, you know, may have been closer in one state in 2012 than it was, or the first year than it was in the second year.
So my question to you is, did you see similar flaws in the GAO study? And you also mentioned that you need to control for certain things if you want to try to accurately measure the effect of a photo ID law. Could you elaborate? Did you look at the GAO study, and what are the factors you need to control for?
No, I think you did a good job of characterizing the GAO study. Look, when I look at data, I look at all the data that's available for all the years that's available when I'm doing the study. And, you know, there's so many things that can affect voter turnout. You mentioned some things, you know, and so I would want to look at not only whether there happened to be a Senate race in one year and not in another year, but how close the race was. You know, those things, as Brace was mentioning, sometimes you'll have a higher turnout because the Senate race may be particularly tough. You know, and you have other laws that are changing at the same time. You know, it's not just photo IDs, but you have things like absentee ballot rules can change. You know, how you can register, lots of things. As I was showing, you have massive changes over this period of time in lots of different rules. And just to focus on one rule and not realize that a lot of rules got changed at the same time in different states, that there's really no way that you can know that it's just, even if you had controlled properly for the closeness of elections and what have you, that you could pick that up. And, you know, initiatives, what I try to do in my work is I have information on, you know, what types of ballot initiatives are going on in each state, because those can be very hot topics in some places.
So is it your answer that you no matter how
I
hard
don't-
you try to control
serious.
for the variables, you're never going to be able to control for all the variables and get a clear answer, or?
Well,
or
I
what?
mean, you do your best on the things, but hopefully we have some objective measure of whether somebody even tries to control for the things or not control for them. And what I can say is, at least in the range of things that I've looked at, you know, what the results are fairly consistent. And so, you know, whether you know, I look at many different types of laws that deal with vote fraud. I deal with initiatives. I deal with, you know, presidential, Senate, gubernatorial elections, how close they are. I have extensive demographic information, other types of things that are there for precisely the reasons that you're bringing up. The points that you're raising are exactly the reasons why you got to control for other things.
And just finally, so was it your conclusion, because you were kind of rushing to finish your presentation, that if you if you make the change to photo ID requirements, it has no significant effect on
Yeah,
turnout?
right. I mean, basically, except when you look at what are places which are considered hotspots for voter fraud, there you actually see a statistically significant increase in turnout. But generally, when you're looking across the whole country, you just never see statistically significant results. Sometimes it's a slight drop that's not statistically significant. Sometimes it's a slight increase that's not statistically significant. But it's really not different from zero. And one of the interesting things I didn't have time to go through is you can break it down by race and gender and age of the different voters. And it's like completely random. You know, so you can't say so you look at blacks, for example. You know, maybe it increases it for black males, you know, 20 to 40, causes it to go down slightly for 40 to 60, and then up again for 60 to 80. You know, it's not, so there's like no systematic effect across races or gender or age that's there. And so it just seems like, and these are virtually always statistically insignificant differences themselves, but there's no pattern that you can look there that says that there's a particular group in the population that seems to have been disadvantaged as a result of these rules.
Do either of you want to comment on that?
I agree.
Yeah.
It's a very complicated issue because there are so many different factors that you have to take into account. The data on all of those factors aren't necessarily consistent from place to place and time to time.
Secretary Buck.
This is my day for election administration.
All right, good.
Provisional ballots. you used some figures that would suggest that 47 states use provisional ballots?
No, I did not put in things in terms of provisional ballot. The EAC, in their study, they have information in terms of that. But it varies across the states in terms of how provisional ballots are implemented. Sometimes they're a high percentage, sometimes they're a low percentage. And so you've really got to understand what's going on to figure out, is provisional ballots having an impact or not having an impact? I know in my state, in my jurisdiction, in Prince William County, we have a relatively low number of provisional ballots in the states. But other states, they have a high rate of provisional ballot. So it varies across the board.
From a just pure management standpoint, in Ohio, you must vote in the precinct in which you're registered.
Right.
Because there are local issues that differ from precinct to precinct. And therefore, provisional ballots are used when you don't pop up in your right precinct. But, you know, they can correct for that.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Some states don't allow to correct for that. Other states do say that that portion of the ballot that you are
That's right.
eligible for, you could have that portion counted, while in other states, they knock out the entire ballot.
But given the diversity of our system and the, you know, in that case, the disintegration of our system, that is a position that is generally accepted as an acceptable practice based on the state reaching that conclusion, that this is the way they want to manage their elections.
It is governed by the state law that does that, yes.
Okay. The second point is, Dr. Smith, what have we seen in terms of early voting? I know that in 2002, we were looking at, in Ohio, I'll just use Ohio, a week. Then all of a sudden it was 2 weeks, and now it is 30 days, which puts added financial burden on strapped local boards of elections. Apart from that financial burden, what have we seen in terms of early voting? Is there a higher chance of manipulation or error, or what's been our learnings from the 30-day window versus the 2-week window versus the week window?
I'm going to punt to these guys because they looked at this more carefully than I have.
Oh, okay.
I think Jim will probably have done more on this.
We have taken a look at that kind of a circumstance. I know in my own county, we have relatively long period of time where you can come in and vote an absentee ballot. In my county, we don't staff all 4 sites for absentee ballots for the entire time period. We only have 2 of those open for the first 2 weeks, and then we open all 4 for the 2 weeks closest to the election. We've found that that is a lot better use of management and time and cost to be able to facilitate the voters. They're not always interested that far out. Some of them are, you know, so you make that opportunity, but you certainly kind of compact that area into a set period of time closer to the election.
In my work, I find that basically once it's more than a week that you have for this pre-voting, it has a small but very small effect in terms of the increased participation that you're going to be having.
Commissioner Adams?
Mr. Brace, you said you found approximately just over 10% of inactive voters in Prince William County voted in 2016. Is that about right?
Actually, it was in 2014.
2014.
We did that study, yes.
Is what separates an active from an inactive voter essentially just filling out a form in the polling place and then being able to vote?
In Virginia, yes, you basically state that you are a resident. There was no reason for me to not get that piece of mail or whatever, and you can end up voting in that case.
When you worked on the EAC survey, was there any thought given to collapsing these two categories together, or otherwise treating active and inactive as if you testified that some inactive states don't report that? Shouldn't they be reporting the number of inactives if they're eligible to vote just by filling out a form?
I believe that really you should have both sets of numbers, but you should keep them apart so you can understand the differences between them. Indeed, if we have inactive numbers in a state where it's a low percentage that is inactive, then you can end up having a different impact. But clearly, when you look at the data across the board, by adding in the inactive in many instances, you get some of those instances that I explained that are more than 100% of the voting age or the citizenship voting age.
Let me come back to that in a second. Election data services, you testified about some of the public information. Some states you can get voter lists and so forth, like the commission has asked for. Has election data services had the occasion to compile voter lists and receive this information?
We only do that when we're under consulting contract with the jurisdiction. So we're an extension of the jurisdiction. We're working with them. We do a lot of work with re-precincting and helping the jurisdiction reassign the polling places and that sort of thing. And in that instance, we're taking the voter file and geocoding it so that we have the proper location of where each of these voters are to help us redesign the precinct. But in those instances, that's the only reason why we have a voter file. It's to do internal work for their purposes, not for campaigns or anything like that.
Understood. Last question. You testified about the 100% figure, and you also testified about error in the census decennial and ACS.
Right.
Can you ascribe a quantitative value to the error rate for both of those? Do you have one that you assume or infer or incorporate?
I don't think you could come up with one single number. I know that in the 2010 census that they did have an overcount and an undercount. It was in the very low percentages, but it was still there. It varied by demographics, by different geographies, that sort of thing. So that's important to understand the variation on that side. On the ACS, the American Community Survey, they have that margin of error, the MOE, so that you can calculate that. It does show you that when you get down to smaller levels of geography, smaller numbers of people, that MOE becomes very large. And so it becomes a problem to have accurate numbers there. And indeed, as I was showing you in terms of the registration numbers, we've got so many small jurisdictions that those MOEs really go beyond the span of what the numbers are showing.
Okay, we're out of time, and it's been an amazing presentation by this first panel. We're going to go ahead and, first of all, thank you, panelists, for your presentations and for the material you've submitted. And obviously, we could keep going on this topic for hours. But I want to now move to item number 4, which we moved up to the 3rd position on the agenda, and that is the demonstration of the historic New Hampshire voting machines that are still being used. And I'll turn it over to Secretary Gardner to introduce the presenters on that topic.
Thank you. This is just a light moment, but in New Hampshire, every polling place has an elected moderator. The people who live in the area that polling place covers choose a person to be the moderator. And it's usually someone who is stable, civil, can bring sides together because of our traditional town meetings. So they also decide how they're going to actually vote. And any town that wants to vote on a paper ballot, every town has to vote on a paper ballot, but whether it's counted by hand or counted by a machine. And so in 1892, the Secretary of State was required to purchase 272 polling place ballot boxes. That's how many polling places we had then. And at the time, the Secretary of State purchased a ballot box that had a voting machine as part of the ballot box. And That voting machine had been patented 2 years earlier in 1890 by a person from Troy, New York. Well, we still have towns in the state that use that same ballot box with that same machine. They've been using it in every election for 125 years. And so we have here today 2 of those town boxes, and we have the moderators. And both these towns, one is over near the state of Maine, only about 6 miles from Maine, and the other one is over on the other side, closer to Vermont. But they have been doing this ever since the presidential election of 1892. And you can see a little bit on the, it actually counts how many ballots goes into the box. In each ballot that goes in, so you have a count at the end, right in the front, because that was really important in those days, how many ballots were actually cast. And so I'm going to have the two moderators. These towns' tradition, moderators serve for a long time, usually unless they do something that's unfair, or people usually keep them because they were chosen for a certain reason. And the 2 are Thayer Bryant, you stand Thayer, and Pat Hines. Thayer's from Eaton and Pat Hines is from Windsor. And we've brought some Windsor ballots and some Eaton ballots, and why don't they have, and there were 2 sizes. So the state purchased two sizes of ballot boxes, and it says on it the federal, because they were the type of boxes that the federal government had for arms and ammunition. And so they're built strong. That's why they've lasted like all this time. And so why don't you take it from...
Every election day, and this box has been used not for town elections, county elections, state elections, and federal elections, as Secretary Gardner said, for the last 125, 26 years. As registered voters come in, they approach 2 ballot clerks, they state their name, they show their identification,